my training not in my mother tongue, and we speak here a language which was my, I think it was my fifth language, and a language which I really enjoy, and I live a big part of my life in it. So let me share my screen with you. Just a moment, I'm trying to multitask here. Yes. And second. Okay. Do you see it now? Irina, can you confirm if you see it, please? Okay.
Yes, I see.
Do you see the presenter's view, or do you see just one slide?
I see, so who coaches whom, and I see several pages around.
Okay, just a moment. Well, I'm not a master of technology, but we get it now.
Now I see your screen.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Now it's just presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So the question "who" is always related to identity, and I was, preparing for this presentation. I was wondering who I am and what is my identity, and I think that I could say that I have an integrated identity, which is made up of several linguistic identities. And if you look into the literature about languages and working in different languages, you can read and hear that people have different emotions in different languages. So I was just reflecting that maybe I think I'm the happiest in English. And I'm most intimate with my children and in Hungarian language, and with my husband in Lithuanian language. So who I am, and it's not that easy to define, because when you speak so many languages, you have just so many different experiences when you live in those languages. And I speak about 5 languages, which are very different and which have very different cultural backgrounds. And I have a Master of Arts in linguistics, and I taught languages for a few years, and I worked as an interpreter for 10 years. And interpretation wasn't just simple translating one word into another language, and it wasn't just about helping people to understand what they say, but it was much more. It was helping them to understand about each other's culture, helping them to understand how they think and what's the mindset behind the language, and also helping them to understand at what level of human maturity they are. So as you see, language is a very big part of my life, and it does interest me very much. It makes me curious, and I am in contact with many languages every day, because at our dinner table or breakfast table, we speak at least 2 languages. Here is my family, and I have bilingual children, and just watching them, growing up and getting acquainted with languages and getting acquainted with the world through the different languages actually gave me a very interesting understanding about how we relate to the languages. First of all, what I noticed, what you could see if you came to have dinner with me and my family, you would see that my kids just look at me and they switch automatically to Hungarian, and when they look at their father, they switch automatically to Lithuanian. So I was very interested of what's happening in the brain, and how do we relate to language, and how children perceive the world, the reality, when they grow up in a family where they hear every day 2 languages. when my son was 3 years old, then I did my research on bilingual, simultaneous bilingual development. And I was just, running after him all the time and recording him, and with my notebook writing down what he's saying and noticing what's happening with him. And one day, when he was 3, he asked me something in Lithuanian language, because that's very normal for bilingual kids, that they don't always have the appropriate words for everything. So they might switch from one language to the other. And I responded very unexpectedly to him in Lithuanian. And he got puzzled and said, "Mom, you should not say like that to me." And it was so interesting that he saw my identity, that I'm a mom who has to speak Hungarian to him, but it was okay when I spoke Lithuanian to my husband. And then I noticed that it's described also in the literature, and I noticed also in my kids that they started to look to the world through the perspective of the language. And because I'm a woman and I speak Hungarian, my son, when he was 2, for a while he thought that every woman speaks Hungarian and every man speaks Lithuanian. So he could speak Hungarian to my mom, but he couldn't speak that to my dad, because as he looked at him and when he saw that he's a man, his brain just did not work in Hungarian language. So it was really fascinating to see that language is much more than just a set of words. So this is how I got very much interested in what's happening. And also I noticed my daughter went to an American kindergarten since she was 3. And so she was trilingual from very early childhood. And I noticed a very interesting thing, that her personality changes when she speaks English, and she becomes like a little American girl. And it was like, it's the same person, so it wasn't that radical that you would notice just immediately that she has like 3 personalities. No, this is not about, having some kind of disorder. But if you paid enough attention to her, you could notice that when she switches the language and she starts thinking in a different language, and that's much more than just thinking, because there is a lot of emotions behind that. It's a whole world behind that language. So with this, I started to be very curious about the languages and how does that impact us, our relationships. And in this presentation, I would like to briefly talk to you a little bit about my findings, about what is mother tongue, and do we have one definition for that? Then what is identity, and what has been found about the multilingualism in therapeutic relationships? Because unfortunately about coaching, we don't have yet so much research. We can just look into the therapeutical research and then make conclusions for ourselves. And of course, because this conference is about coaching, the implications are for coaching. So what can we learn about studying languages and linguistics, about what happens to clients when they are coached not in their mother tongue, and what happens to the coach when the coach coaches a client in a different language, or a client who doesn't speak his mother tongue. So this is how I got very much interested. And there were also a couple of other things which, from neuroscientific perspective, got my attention. When I did my research on bilingualism, I came across studies about aphasia. And aphasia is a certain brain, not disorder, is a damage in one certain part of the brain, which is very much related to the use of the language. And there are different types of aphasias. One is called Wernicke, the other one Broca aphasia. And in one case, the center of the brain is damaged, which contains the vocabulary. So just imagine a person being able to apply all the grammar rules, but not being able to recall any normal word from Russian language or English language or other language. And then there is the other type of aphasia, which when the person is able to say all the words and use normal English, Russian, or other words, but there is no grammar in it. But what was more fascinating, it was that actually one language could be damaged while the other wasn't damaged. So where is the language then in our head, and how is that related to how we perceive the world and to who we are? What happens if one of our language is damaged and the other one is not? So what happens to our identity? And that was very fascinating for me. And I also found another thing in the literature, and if I recall it right, because I didn't go back to my own master thesis, but that was so outstanding that I hope I have the full memory. It was about a woman. She was her mother tongue was Swedish language, and she lived in America. And I think she got stroke. And after the stroke, after the brain damage, she was actually able to speak only one language, and that was English. So she could have a verbal conversation only in English language. But when she got upset, she wasn't able to express emotions in English, but she switched to Swedish language. And she could speak about the emotions and express the emotions in Swedish. But she couldn't have a normal verbal conversation in Swedish, just in that very intense emotional situation. So again, back to the question, who we are and what's happening. And you know, which is the language which is stronger in our brain, and where do we store those languages? One question could be, if you research bilingualism, is what is your mother tongue? Is mother tongue the language which is spoken by your parents, by your mom? But, you know, if you grow up in a family where actually mom doesn't speak the first language but speaks the second language to you, so you don't speak your mother's language. So what is the mother tongue? Is it then first language? Is it the language which you heard first and which you learned to count in, which you learned to actually have your first conversation? Maybe we could say that. But what happens if you are not the most confident in that language? If you, for example, went to a school where you learned everything in a second language, and that language is stronger for you. What happens if you actually, like me, you work in a completely different language, and that's not your first language, it's not your second language, but it's a language which you learn later. So the research defines mother tongue based on different perspectives. You can take a psychological perspective, a sociological perspective, and there is no one single definition for the mother tongue. And I think that is important for us because often we might have the tendency of saying that the best coaching can happen in someone's mother tongue, or you can coach only in your mother's tongue. But if there is no a single definition, then how would you say which is the language you can coach best in? And here is another interesting thing. One day, I had a conversation with my friend who also speaks different languages. And I think we spoke a little bit about swear words. And I told in English a few swear words, and she said, "Wow, how can you use them?" And I said, "They are just words. It's like table, it's like chair, and they do have a negative emotional connotation for me." And that was a very big revelation, because and by the way, that was studied also by Hungarian psychologists in the 1920s by Sándor Ferenc, that words have an emotional connotation. And if you learn something in your childhood, when you have very intensive emotions, then those words will not be just words for you, but will have those feelings which were associated. And in English or in Lithuanian, when I had to translate words. And also, I wasn't in my childhood punished for using swear words in English because I didn't speak English. However, in Hungarian, the same swear words have the shame with them. It goes a different emotion. And this is just one example of how in different languages the same words, or actually the representative of those words, can have a completely different reaction for us emotionally. So as you see, words are strongly related to emotions. They are strongly related to memories and to life experiences. And here we can ask the question, why is this important? And I was wondering that if, you know, I have in my mother tongue this that connotation with swear words, for example. How is that with the beliefs? Because in coaching we work a lot with the beliefs. And in which language is a belief stronger? Is it stronger if I say it in Hungarian? And would that have a bigger impact on me? Or is that stronger in English or Lithuanian or other languages? And you can do a little bit of experiment here with me. If you can recall a couple of limiting beliefs you have now, then you might want to just jot them down. And if you speak several languages, you could try to see how is the impact of those limiting beliefs for you in your mother tongue and in second or third language. Is it the same or is it different? In what language is easier to change those limiting beliefs and to find a counter belief for it? Would it be in your mother tongue or your first language, or would it be in a different language? And I don't have, you know, a very specific answer here, but from my experience, what I noticed, and I will be curious, so if you please put it in the chat box, if you have some insights regarding this. But what I noticed that when I speak English or do something in English, actually I do not have the same limiting beliefs, or they even do not get activated because the words do not trigger those beliefs. And I have a hypothesis here, which is also backed a little bit with research in the psychotherapeutical literature. So my hypothesis here is that it is easier to change the limiting beliefs using a foreign language, using a second language, even if the limiting belief emerged or was created in your first language. So why do I say that? I say that because if we look again into the literature about language use in psychotherapy, and recently in the 90s and the 80s and the 90s, there was quite a lot of research done, but not before that so much. It was noticed that that sometimes clients who are bilingual and who work with a bilingual therapist, they even switch to another language when they come across an emotion or a belief, something what is not that pleasant for them. And they switch the language because they want to gain distance, because they want to defend themselves. So a second language can become a defense mechanism. But also the opposite is true, that if they spoke in a second language and the memory or something happened in the first language for them, or in those situations when he spoke the first language, then they couldn't recall the memory just using the second language and discussing it in the second language. They actually had to switch to that linguistic mindset to be able to access it. And then, researchers started to look into, okay, so could we use this consciously? So, for example, could we invite the client to actually just analyze a limiting belief in another language? And the research shows that it's much easier to intellectualize and use a cognitive approach to negative beliefs or to emotions in another language, because we do not have that emotional tie to it. And that can be quite useful in coaching from many perspectives. One perspective is that, of course, if you speak several languages and your client speaks several languages, then you can play with that. You can switch from one language to the other language. But also, if you coach the client in a second or third language, then it might be quite easy for the client to have a cognitive discussion about those beliefs and to change them. Now the question can be, will that belief actually change? And again, if we look into the research, then we find that it can, because we can create a new life experience, and it will be, these languages and these life experiences will not be separate in the brain and in our identity from each other. Because we talk about identity, and we ask the question what identity is. And again, if you look into monolingual people, you could define that, well, identity is made up of beliefs, is made up of values, of the cultural heritage, personality, and of course, life experience also adds to our identity. But what would you say about a person, a bilingual or a multilingual, who has learned the language in different cultures, and who has not one cultural heritage, but has multiple cultural heritages, and has values from, and even beliefs from multiple cultures? If you ask, and I think that some of them are also multilingual, so if you ask yourself, what's your identity? With whom could you identify yourself? I think the multilinguals will say, well, I do have a more nuanced or a nuanced identity. Or someone would say, well, I have multiple identities. But I would avoid this concept, because this is not, again, about some kind of disorder. It's not a schizophrenia to have multiple identities. But actually, we do have nuances in our identities, and as you heard me saying, that we have different emotional connotations with the same words in different languages. And as my daughter, she acts differently when she speaks English. So we do have a certain kind of different identity styles or different expressions of the identity in these languages. And when we sit down in a coaching interaction, so who sits down with whom, and who is coaches whom? Which of my identity is coaches the client's identity, and which identity? So that's a question which I think I will not answer completely to you, but we can just play a little bit with it, and you can think about yourself also as a coach. When you sit down, which part of yourself or which part of your identity is sitting down with one client? And what do you activate in yourself when you speak English or other language? And what is the perception of your reality when you speak English or other language? And what do you filter out? What is not becoming available to you? And I think these are very important questions when we coach. And I would say that when you speak multiple languages, that's a very big richness, because you learn to see the world from different perspectives. You learn that actually the world is much more colorful than it seems to be in one language, even if it's very colorful in one language, but in more languages, it's much more colorful. You learn that people have different mindsets, they have different approaches, they think differently. And you become more flexible in this sense. But it's also important to know that just because I coach in a different language, it's a richness, but also I might filter out some things, because English is related to the English life experiences more closely than to other life experiences. And as a coach, I have to be aware of how do I integrate everything and how do I approach the client. One thing what is important for us and what we can do is creating a psychological contract. And when you coach a person in a different language, I mean, you speak a different language and your client speaks a different language, it's also useful, necessary, and very interesting to have a conversation about the language, about how do you perceive the world, what would be important to pay attention to notice, what could be a potential maybe misunderstanding, or how can you maybe not see each other's realities just because you have those different languages. And of course, we could continue the list with many, many questions. But back to the literature, I also wanted to give you another thing which might be quite interesting, that even when you think about bilingual and multilingual people, it's important, was the language learned in the same cultural setting? So for example, my kids in my family speak 2 languages, and they actually, even if they use the words differently, for these 2 languages which they learned in the same house, they will not have so many different references. But if someone learned the languages in different environments, so let's say I learned Finnish in Finland, and in Finland the snow was different than in Hungary, because in Finland and Lapland there are many, many types of snows. I will have already a different understanding about the snow when I speak Finnish language. And these kind of bilinguals are called coordinated bilinguals, versus the others are compound bilinguals. And for these bilinguals, it becomes an interesting task to actually integrate these different worlds, these different cultures. And when you coach someone who comes from different cultural backgrounds, from different realities, that's also something to pay attention to. That can be also a benefit, and that can be also a disadvantage sometimes if we do filter that out, if we don't pay attention that some experiences might have happened in a different culture and in a different language. So let me give an example based on what the psychological literature says, that certain, as I mentioned earlier, that certain memories might not become available in a second or third language. Of course, in coaching, we don't work with the past and we don't have to recall childhood memories. But if you ask your client that, well, could you share a success story with me, what has happened in your life? And sometimes we have to be mindful that maybe the client has less success stories in the language he lives now. And maybe we need to encourage the client to think in multiple languages during the coaching session, even if we can't switch to speak different languages in the same session. But just encourage the client to be free to access more languages, to play in his different languages, because that can be a big richness again to the coaching session. And also, it's important to pay attention to the metaphors when we speak about languages. There are universal metaphors, but not so many. Every language has a different sets of metaphors. And if you work in two different if you work in the same language with the client, but you have different first languages, the client also sometimes might translate the metaphors from one language to the other language. And in this case, it's so important not to correct the metaphors, not to think that that's a language mistake. It might be, but maybe it's, the perception of his reality is translated into a language, into another language. And in this case, the grammar, the grammatical accuracy, and the language accuracy is much less important than actually what is the world behind those words. So that's a way how the conversation can be so enriched, and how can you use the language not just as a mean for the conversation, but also to discover much more about your client, to uncover much more about the client's identity. And as coaches, we do that a lot. And we work a lot with helping the client to learn about himself and to understand, to build a more integrated identity. In certain therapeutical settings, it was noticed that bilingual therapists actually use consciously the switch of language. Earlier, I mentioned about the memories, that it's easier to recall some of the memories in the mother tongue, and in the other language is easier to intellectualize. However, there is another important thing which we need to be aware of, and that's called the transference and the counter-transference. And it was noticed that when the therapist and the client have the same first language, then counter-transference might happen easily. Maybe it's easier than when the therapist speak a foreign language, and it's not the therapist's first language, and it's not the therapist's first language. But of course, there are also other circumstances which might speed up the occurrence of the countertransference. But what I want to emphasize with this is that sometimes we think that coaching in a second language is a weakness because we might not have enough words, we might not be able to understand fully the client or to function really well. But there are also benefits which are sometimes disadvantages in coaching in the first language, the client in the first language. So, and that was the example of the countertransference, that in a foreign language you might not run that easily in countertransference, that just because of the lack of certain life experiences which could anchor that. And another benefit of coaching in a foreign language is that you start paying attention to different things. If you're not 100% perfect in a foreign language, like I am not in English, I am fluent, but I'm not perfect. So there are things which might become much more important than, you know, the story, the content of the story. So we might be more sensitive to paying attention to the nonverbal communication, to the nuances in the tonality of the client. Also, we might, you know, listen more accurately to the keywords, to the key messages. And this becomes a richness. Instead of getting lost in the story, we become very curious about and what's above or beyond or behind the story. So working in a second language, it might be just a fantastic, fascinating experience for the coach and also for the client. And also briefly, I would share one last story that sometimes I coach with interpreter without having a common language at all. And that's also a great experience of discovering how that works, what you notice in the client without understanding anything, and what comes through the interpreter. So I would like to encourage you to first of all, to learn languages, because that's really, really interesting. It's not always easy, but it's a lovely experience. And then if you have, you know, thought that maybe your language is not yet perfect, just forget about it. Start coaching and pay attention to the advantages rather to the disadvantages, and be open and curious for discovering different things.
Thank you, Leda, a lot. Actually, we are on time and we have another 5 minutes for questions.
Yes.
Okay, Leda, it will be my pleasure to ask you. So we are colleagues as well. So I'm a linguist too, and I teach and coach in German, Spanish, and English. And of course, in my native tongue, Russian. That's why I have a question. What's your favorite language to coach people?
That's a good question. Actually, it's English. My favorite language for coaching is English. I learned coaching in English, and I find the structure of English language very easy for coaching. You can, with very short sentences, you can ask very deep questions, and you don't need to explain a lot.
Okay, great. And maybe one more question. So what can be the first step for coaches who would like to start to coach in English? I mean, for Russian-speaking coaches, from your experience.
I think, you know, just having the mindset of experimenting. Just experimenting and wanting to discover something, because language learning, well, it never ends, actually. I think that we can always fine-tune our use of language and learn something. And when you start coaching in English or other foreign language, it's such a rich experience. And of course, be curious about the language, about how your client uses, how you use it. but don't miss that opportunity.
Okay, Leda, thank you very much for your presentation and that you have found time to join us with your busy schedule. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and enjoy your conference.
Thank you very much. It was really very deep research, because in the chat I saw a big discussion, so generated by your presentation. And
I
now
will read it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. It was wonderful, really.